Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give folks just a minute or so to come into our room here. So we'll start at about 2:01. Just as folks come in, I'm seeing our attendees still climbing. All right, looks like things have slowed down a bit, so we'll get started. Thank you all for being here. And today we're going to be doing the seventh installment of our rulemaking meeting series. I'm Ariel Finney, the Washington Cares Fund Policy and Rules Manager. I'm here today with Vicki Bouvier, who's our Washington Cares Fund Workforce Policy Manager. We're part of the Department of Social and Health Services Washington Cares Fund team working on rulemaking for a new chapter of Washington Administrative Code. Each meeting, we're focusing on specific topics related to rulemaking. Today, we are beginning a three-part series on provider rulemaking. So we'll be focusing today on provider the provider application process and provider rights. And then in our upcoming sessions, we'll be covering provider registration, deregistration, and termination of registration. So stay tuned for those. I'll give you some more information about when we will be having our next session here shortly. We will only be addressing rulemaking for the Department of Social and Health Services. Employment Security Department is also doing rulemaking, so please reach out to Employment Security Department if you are interested in their rulemaking activities. Our agenda is up on the screen. We will be following the same format we have been. So if you have joined us in the past, this should look fairly familiar in how we're structuring this meeting. If you're joining us though for the first time, you'll see that we're going to be covering some housekeeping and common terms first. We'll go into a brief presentation by Vicki on the provider application process, provider rights, and we'll use that information to inform our discussion, where I have a series of questions laid out that I'm going to be asking you all here in the audience, looking for input and feedback and just ideas that we will use to help us draft our rules here for providers. This session is scheduled for 2 hours, but we've consistently been running closer to about 1 hour. Some of them have been a little bit longer than that, but pretty consistently we've been at about 1 hour. So I expect we're going to wrap up early today, but we do have plenty of time for discussion to see wherever, as we work through our discussion, we have some room there. Should have plenty of time. So some housekeeping. We have the question and answer feature available for questions throughout the presentation today. We'll do our best to address these questions as we go, but if we don't get to it live, we'll do our best to either follow up with you later or give you some resources on where to turn for that, and I will share some here shortly. The chat is disabled during the presentation, but I am going to be opening that up when we get to our discussion prompts. So if you would like to engage through the chat, you're going to be able to do that. We will also have the option to raise your hand and share verbally as well. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording of the webinar and the slide deck that we're going to be reviewing today will be available on the website on the screen. I will share this link in the chat here shortly as well, so you're going to be able to have access to that, as well as our other departments who are doing rulemaking, the links to their rulemaking sites. But if you or somebody you know would like to come back and look at this presentation today or the information shared today, the recording will be available. I do my best to get that done by the end of the week, but sometimes we have a little bit of delay and it happens first thing next week, but it will be there shortly. Our next meeting is going to be on June 12th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. And that's where we're going to be talking about registration requirements. We'll touch on that a little bit today as we talk about registration as it relates to our statute for the Washington Cares Fund program. But we will get into much more detail on June 12th at 2 o'clock. Our purpose today is to hear ideas from you all about rulemaking. We are just beginning our initial draft of rules and want to hear the values of our community so we can integrate that feedback into our drafts. Our focus today is on rulemaking and hearing your ideas and recommendations. In order to remain focused on the purpose of our meeting, we will not be addressing any program-related questions. If you have questions about the WA Cares Fund program, you can email wacares@dshs.wa.gov, and our customer care team members will assist in answering your questions. So again, today, my hope is to hear from you, to get some ideas. We are just about to start drafting this section of our chapter, and the information that we've been hearing in past sessions has been really, really helpful as we start putting kind of pen to paper and thinking about the values that we hear in these sessions. So please know when you share, that's valuable for us to be hearing, and we are using the material for our consideration in drafts. I want to go over some common terms, some of which we will likely use along the way today. We certainly in government and especially in WA Cares have a lot of different terms that we have normalized, but may not be as familiar to you if you're joining us, especially for the first time. So I want to take a few minutes here just to chat a little bit about these terms, give you some context for them, and I'm going to do my best to make sure that if we use terms later on in this session today, that we clarify those terms, just to make sure that we understand what they are representing. So we'll start with the Department of Social and Health Services. I am part of the Department of Social and Health Services, and we're here today to talk about rulemaking for the Department of Social and Health Services. We are the lead in the Washington Cares Fund project. This meeting series is focused on our rulemaking, but you'll also hear us refer to the Department of Social and Health Services as DSHS. Employment Security Department also has a major role in this project. They're leading work on employee contributions. You will commonly hear the Employment Security Department referred to as ESD. The Healthcare Authority is the third department responsible for a major part of the Washington Cares Fund program. They're responsible for the payment system, verifying use of benefits, and establishing criteria for payment of benefits to providers. You will commonly hear the Healthcare Authority referred to as HCA. Long-term services and supports, or LTSS, refers to a variety of services and resources to assist people who experience a long-term disability to maintain their safety and comfort. The Revised Code of Washington, or RCW, refers to our statute or the language enacted by the legislature. These are the laws that provide program direction, limitations, and grant permissions to state agencies for rulemaking. You've already heard me use the term Washington Cares Fund. We will also commonly refer to ourselves as WA Cares Fund or WA Cares. I will do my best to stick with Washington Cares Fund, but by nature, I revert back to WA Cares Fund or WA Cares. You'll also see WA Cares Fund or Washington Cares Fund referred to as WCF. Washington Administrative Code, or WAC, WAC, are rules developed by government agencies to implement policies and procedures as delegated by the legislature. You may also hear WACs referred to as rules or regulations. When I refer to rulemaking, it's regarding developing or amending Washington Administrative Code, or WAC, and that is what we're here to do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki Bouvier, who's going to lead us through the application process and provider rights. I will stop here and turn to you, Vicki.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vicki Bouvier. I am one of the Washington Cares Fund workforce policy managers, and I'll be walking you through the content of the application process, and we'll be covering more of the details in the next meeting later in June. So we operate for the purpose of registering providers. We operate off of this statute you see on the screen, RCW 50B.04.020 subsection 3. And it requires us to register long-term services and supports providers who meet minimum qualifications applicable in law. So things like a license that's issued to become an adult family home, home care agency license issued by the Department of Health, different agencies, and this minimum qualifications. We also are responsible to discontinue registration of long-term services and supports providers if they fail to meet the minimum qualifications that are established in law, or if they violate the operational standards of the program. And all of these elements will be established in rule so that it's very clear where, how decisions on registration and deregistration are made. Next slide, please. So the application process is to submit a complete application, followed by working with either the Department of Social and Health Services, Washington Cares Fund program staff, or the Area Agency on Aging staff to execute a WA Cares specific contract to provide goods and services to beneficiaries. And some registrants, some applicants, I should say, will be working with DSHS, others will be working with the AAAs, depending on what provider type they are, and that information will also be published. DSHS at the end of the process will issue a registration or a denial, which will include information on appeal rights if an applicant is denied registration for WA Cares. Next slide. The general application requirements are, as I said, minimum qualifications are having an agency issued valid license number for the service they're offering to be registered for. So the examples I gave before, an adult family home or a home care agency license, and a Washington business license or proof of exemption from the Washington business license requirement. Providers are also required to do background checks, either name, date of birth background checks, which are run by the State Patrol, or name, date of birth and fingerprint background checks. And fingerprint background checks are done by the FBI. And those designations about which type of background check is required are identified in statute. And then there are several other pieces of information that I'll describe in the next couple of slides as well. Business organization type is an application element to identify what type of business the provider operates. Addresses that are relevant to their business operations, business address, billing facility, or mailing addresses. Next slide. Each registered provider would need to give us their taxpayer identification number, and that's either a Social Security number or an employer identification number. If a provider is a registered nonprofit entity, then the 501c statement, if that's applicable. And the also, if the business is minority or woman-owned or veteran-owned business, then we'd need the certification number from Office of Minority and Women-Owned Business. Sorry, I stumble over that every time. We'd also need the primary contact person for the registration application, additional persons authorized to sign contracts, and there is a requirement to have liability insurance for each registered provider. Next slide, please. Application completion is a fairly short process. The online application form would have required fields. So the information would have to be provided in each field before submission. And that again includes minimum qualifications, the background check authorization form for us to run the background check. And by us, I mean our background check central unit, not the Washington Cares Fund program. That's a distinct portion of the agency that manages those. as well as all of the other contract information that I went over in the previous slides. And then in addition to that, there would be an attestation that you would sign as an applicant, attesting that all the information provided is correct at the time of application submission, that the applicant would comply with all applicable statutes and rules as a registered provider, and the provider after registration would only engage with beneficiaries when operating under a fully executed contract. And that's to ensure that the beneficiary knows that they're interacting with someone who they can use their benefit to pay, and also for the provider so that they can be paid for services rendered. Next slide. We are looking to your feedback to help us establish application time limits. We will be establishing a time limit for applications so that we can prioritize applications and complete the application process consistently and timely. If the time limit is not met, the application would be returned to the applicant for withdrawal. And withdrawal of applications is not an application denial. So it's not an agency action that would carry any negative consequence. At any time after that, the applicant could decide to reapply and have their registration application processed and a decision made at a later date. Next slide. So provider rights are rights that are established in statute in some instances, and then rights that we would establish in rule, consistent with best practice and recommendations. So next slide. Now, these are this particular statute is specific to a right that is established in our Washington Cares Fund statute, and that determinations made by DSHS, the WA Cares Fund program, for registration applications or registered providers are subject to appeal in accordance with the Administrative Procedure Act, and that's chapter 34.05. So agency actions to register, deregister a provider, those are appealable decisions. And that is a primary right established in statute for applicants and registered providers. Next slide. So you can see here the first one is the appeal right that I just described. We also would extend provider rights to interpreter services and translated documents for providers, allow equal access to become a provider, and eliminate hurdles, unnecessary hurdles for becoming a registered provider, to hold application information confidential. As I highlighted in a previous slide, we'll be collecting information such as tax identification numbers, and those are confidential information. A provider may voluntarily withdraw or deregister at any time they choose. And application assistance will be offered to any provider who needs it, either from a WA Cares Fund staff here at DSHS or through an area agency on aging. And the final piece is timely claims payment. So timely submission of claims is something that we'll talk about, and that we will establish in rule, and then we want to make sure we're doing our part in processing those claims in a timely fashion as well, so that providers are paid for the services that they provide beneficiaries in as quick a process as possible. Next slide. And I'll hand it over to Ariel.
All right, thank you so much, Vicki. I really appreciate you giving us a overview of those things to give us a foundation to start our discussion from. With that, I'm going to be turning on our chat feature so folks are able to respond to our prompts that we're about to get to via chat if you wish to do so. And with that, to participate in the discussion, you can use chat. You can also raise your hand, and I'm going to do my best to catch that quickly. And you can raise your hand. I will change the settings so you can unmute yourself and share verbally if you'd like. I do ask, though, that those who are sharing verbally just be aware of the time. While I'm not necessarily going to be timing you, I do ask that you kind of try to think around 2 minutes for sharing per topic, knowing you can always raise your hand again and we can continue the discussion, but just leaving room for folks to participate. All right, well, with that, let's get on to our first prompt. What are preferred ways to submit information to another entity? And again, that's what are preferred ways to submit information to another entity. And specifically, we're thinking about how would you want to submit information to the WA Cares Fund program, recognizing though that you may have had different experiences working with different entities in different capacities, thinking through kind of leaving that open. But we're thinking around what is the best way as we think about this process to share information or get information for the application to the department. So I'll pause here. Let us think about that. Again, the chat's open. I see someone already responding saying via email is our preferred method. And I see a comment here or a question saying people will have time limits when applying. Will DSHS be required to process applications in a timely manner? Yes, certainly we are considering the timeframes both ways. So that I think we have a question coming up about time limits, but we are considering how long do we have to get the job done, either way. So I see online upload of documents, a question regarding will this contract be something that covers the entire state or individual areas like normal DSHS contracts? So Heather, right now we're still working through a lot of the details around that, but we should have kind of both options depending on the type of service that we have. That's going to be contracted for. Some of them make sense to be across the whole state. Some of them make sense to only be in the community in which that company can serve. So working through that, but that's where we have both DSHS and the area agencies on aging or AAAs, both involved in the contracting process. So we can either be at the statewide level or at the local community level. All right, and some questions around would these application requirements apply across provider types? Would there be additional requirements for certain types? So I think we're still working through a lot of the minimum qualification work. I don't really have answers for that, but Whitney, I would be very curious if you have thoughts one way or another regarding how requirements should be applied, what to consider there. So certainly happy to hear some feedback on that. I see an idea regarding this prompt about a SharePoint site that shows the movement through the system. I also see another comment regarding email with security options included and secure email and/or secure file transfer. All right. All right. What else? Any other thoughts or pieces in here as far as what would be preferred? Has anybody had luck with an online system? I know we had SharePoint brought up, but some sort of online application process. I'm kind of thinking about, I was trying to think of an example, but I don't think I have one that maybe all would have experienced, but an idea of maybe having some sort of online portal or something like that, would that, how does that feel? And I'll open that up as well as a follow-up question to you all. And again, the follow-up question is regarding some sort of online portal or online space, taking the email and maybe adding a layer to it. Just thinking about, is there another way that we could use technology to support this work? I see online portal would be a great option, user-friendly. Do you mean like going through Secure Access Washington? And Stephanie, that's a great question. I hadn't thought necessarily through that entirely, or how Secure Access Washington could be involved. But I'd be curious if that is a pro or a con as far as going through Secure Access Washington. Katie says one portal for the entire statewide program would be much preferred compared to different platforms for different AAAs. Okay, it's great to hear. And ensure any portal works for all uses, Washington State or AAA level. Okay, that's great to hear. And when I say also, I want to add that this is certainly a brainstorm. By no means saying for sure we're going to have some sort of portal or anything like that, but just thinking through different ways things can be submitted. Recognizing nobody's brought up snail mail, so I'm not going that direction, but thinking about, what are the options that are out there and how do they feel as far as being accessible to folks who will be using the application process. All right, I see Joan saying, if online options are used, can there be an option to have text alerts sent to applicant when the process is complete? It's a great idea. Whitney seconding Katie's idea. One place to view all would be appreciated. No fax. We need to move past faxing. And that speaks to my heart for sure. I have moved on from faxing. I don't know about you all. Beth has said, if you have a secure site and multiple stakeholders could see the status as people are waiting for approval and timely information is key. And I see another vote for Katie's idea. Wonderful. All right. So it sounds like digital submission, as I see Cole just said, either email or shared portal. It sounds like the group is really liking both of those ideas, that we have email, online portals, great. But really we're thinking some version of online sharing is the way to go, not through faxing or through manually sending mail through the postal service. And I see online portal through SAW. All right. And I did bring up a question about the SAW, the Secure Access Washington, and whether or not it's a pro or a con to have Secure Access Washington involved. I am by no means knowledgeable about how that works, but curious if that feels like a pro or a con to those who have brought up SAW or again Secure Access Washington. All right, I see Secure Access Washington works for us in Southwest Washington. Wonderful, thanks, Whitney. And then I see as a provider, we're required to use it by our AAA. I think it'd be good if it's created to be user-friendly. Okay, wonderful, thank you. Thank you both. All right, well, if you're typing, keep typing, that's okay. We can continue to cover this topic. I am going to move to the next question, so you just have a chance to think about this. Our next question is, what do you think is a reasonable application approval timeline, and why do you think that? And that's really thinking about from the start of the application process to the end, what's the time frame that needs to be completed? And that, I would say for this question, is going both sides. What is just generally the time from start to finish it needs to be completed by? So I think that's speaking to a question somebody had earlier around DSHS's timeline. We will address that here. But if you think that there are some differences here that need to be considered, please include that as well. I'm really interested to hear if you think this works in this situation, but these other things need to be considered. Please share that. So again, the question is, what do you think is a reasonable application approval timeline? And why do you think that? All right, Whitney kicked us off here saying current Medicaid contract applications have a 90-day timeline, but if the minimum qualifications are going to be as lean as what is on the slides, I think a shorter time frame could be okay. All right. Heather says 30 days would be more than reasonable from start to approval of application. Clients in need of the services are already waiting for much needed help. Absolutely. Yeah, the whole goal here is to make sure that we have providers and beneficiaries and both are connected. So making sure that we have as lean a process as possible on both sides, I think is a value that we have certainly been talking a lot about, making sure that things move smoothly for folks. And I see Elizabeth says, I assume it can't happen fast enough for someone suddenly needing care and wanting to hire a family member, maybe retro benefit pay for the time it takes. All right, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. And then Stephanie says, how long is the application? And that's something we are still working through. We don't have the application developed yet. We're still in the very beginning stages of thinking through this. So we covered a little bit around the application with Vicky's presentation today around what's going to be required of that. But as far as how long it takes, we really haven't gotten to that level yet. I see Lindsay saying happy medium 1 month to 3 months, depending on complexity. All right, and then we have 30 to 60 days from receipt of a completed application. Often Medicaid contract applications take longer because applicants are missing pieces, but if this is a simpler process, it should go faster. Okay, wonderful. All right, I think that is great to hear. We're generally anywhere from 30 to 90 days. I see timeline will depend on funding at AAA or Area Agency on Aging level for staffing, WellCare's contract support, and actual application requirements. Simpler will be faster. And Stephanie agreed with Lindsay, complexity is what will determine time, I think. All right, that's good to hear. And certainly that is good for us to make sure we're connecting these pieces together to think around what we build and how long does it take. And of course, we're already thinking about in many ways these two pieces, but what I'm hearing is that the more complex, the longer it takes, which makes sense. So thank you for that. All right, what else? And if anybody wants to add in any extra whys or why not, happy to hear that as well. But generally I'm hearing pretty consistently that 30 to 90 days, with a few folks falling in the middle around 60. And I think all of those are reasonable. I think that this process will be very closely in line with what the requirements are for RFPs. I don't know the answer to that, Stephanie. I'm not sure about the RFP requirements for client services, but that's certainly something we can look into and consider when thinking about timelines and the complexity, and using that as a reference point for us. And I see Elizabeth bringing up retro pay with benefits, with their benefits if approved, and they're super extensive. Okay. I think Stephanie's saying they're super extensive in regards to requirements for RFPs, and RFPs are requests for proposals. At least that's how I'm interpreting it. And Stephanie, if I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me. All right, and then Stephen says, it sounds like a beneficiary's claim could be approved 30 to 45 days while they're still waiting for their family caregiver to be approved 30 to 90 days. Yeah, there certainly could be some differences there. And a lot of it, I think, will depend on when the applications start, like who, if the beneficiary starts first and on day 30 says, hey, I want this provider. But we do recognize, especially around family caregivers, the importance of getting them onboarded very quickly. So we kind of have some work still being done. We actually have a lot of work still being done around family caregivers who aren't going to be a formal business with a business license and all of these things that may change this a little bit for a family caregiver. Still so much more to be determined there. We're just in that stage of what would that look like compared to a business who is again, has a business license and all of these requirements associated with that. So a lot to be considering there, but certainly happy to hear thoughts. If there's anything that we should be considering. And we, again, are going to be talking more about registration. And I think as I'm hearing the chat, I'm seeing the connection between our future discussions and this question. So this question may be one that we bring back and talk more about as we get into the details of the registration process. And today we're talking about just generally the application process and how to go through it. Registration really does closely connect with that. And I think we thought a lot about that when talking about the subject and planning the presentation around how closely just the application process and getting through it and registration requirements tie together, but we are keeping them separate. But again, this question may be one that we want to revisit after we present some more information on registration next time. So stay tuned for June 12th, where we will dig into more details around registration, what that means, and again, possibly revisit this question to see if any answers change. All right, I'm seeing things slow down in the chat, so let's put the next question up on the screen. But if you're typing, keep typing. We can always go back to the question. We can keep, I'm happy to bounce around here. So the questions we have up here now are kind of twofold because I recognize the first one may not apply to everybody. But our first question is, what made an experience you had with an application process simple and accessible? And recognizing some folks may not have had an experience with an application process that was simple and accessible. So the second question is, what do you think is important for an application process to be considered simple and accessible? So answer either, answer both, however, whatever one feels like it's connecting with you, but really thinking about, as we've kind of already started talking about a little bit, is like, how do we make this simple? How do we make it accessible for beneficiaries or for providers to come on board to serve beneficiaries, especially in a time crunch? So when we think about a simple and accessible application process, what does that look like? And have you had an experience? What was that experience? And if you haven't, what would be important to you to make something simple and accessible? And again, we have the chat open right now, but you are also welcome to raise your hand at any time. And I'm going to do my best to catch those as they come up. You're welcome to raise your hand if you feel like that's just more an easy way of sharing information or sharing your thoughts. But Heather has kicked us off on this question saying, easy to locate the application and ability to be able to submit online with a confirmation of submission being completed. All right. All right, so easy to locate the application, so we can find what we need to do, and then we can submit it online with a confirmation. It said, important to know all of the requirements up front, a list of all required information and documents in one location that can be referred to during the application process. And that is beautiful because that is in many ways where I see our rules coming into play to say this is what you need to provide for the application process. Not all of it may, maybe there could be some more clarification outside of rule as far as like more of a how-to document, but I do think rules could play an important part here in supporting providers to navigate the application process, making sure that it's clear and understandable as far as what needs to be produced for the application process. So that's why we're here today. That's wonderful, wonderful to share here, Amy. All right, so Carrie said creating an application through Secure Access Washington or SAW. Whitney said any required forms be included at once rather than links that take you to other pages and so on. And Cole said require only minimum requirement standards, make requirements clear, more requirements or process will be more complex and add delay, as much automation as possible. Lindsay said, reminds me a bit of the Department of State passport application process, very clearly stated on their website and information regarding documentation required. I really appreciate the resource there as a place to turn to think about where are there examples of a successful application process. So thank you for sharing that reference there, Lindsay. John said, seconding Amy's idea, and I think Amy said, important to know all the requirements up front. I find it makes it easy if there's a checklist of what will be required on the first page. And Beth said a way to communicate with a subject matter expert to ask specific questions. Documentation can be overwhelming. And Amy is agreeing with a previous comment from Beth, saying contact information, phone and email available if applicants have questions. Wonderful. And that's where we feel, very thankful for our customer care center team who's going to be there to support applicants, answering questions, being available both via email, by phone to help support this. We also have quite a bit of provider support work being done by different teams as well that I think will be involved in the process. So I think that that support element is a big, very valuable part to what we're thinking of. Maybe not valuable part, but a value that we share as far as making sure you have support where you need it. All right. Well, I think this is really helpful to hear. What I'm hearing, of course, is being clear, making requirements clear, making any required forms easily available in one location. It sounds like folks don't want to have to turn to multiple locations. And making sure that we have clear requirements of what is acceptable or not when it comes to submitting information. So that's really helpful to hear. I think that really aligns with what we've been talking about, but also when I think about rules, that thinking about how do we make sure that the rules support the process and support the people who need to navigate this process. All right, well, I'm going to pause here just a little bit to see if anybody else has thoughts. I'm very curious to hear more. Again, if you have references to other systems that have worked, love to see those, love to hear those, because those are great ways for us to get that visual to go, okay, what's working well, and how can we learn from that? All right, I see the Washington Department of Licensing interactive walkthrough regarding documentation needed for an enhanced driver's license is very user-friendly. Great to hear. Thank you again for the point of reference for us. All right, I'm going to put our next question up on the screen, but as always, if you're still typing, please keep typing. Don't stop now. But our next question is, what do you think should be considered for an application process for provider registration? And we have touched on this already in multiple ways, but I'm trying to leave this pretty open to make sure that I haven't asked a question that is so narrow that it left something out. So what do you think should be considered for an application process for provider registration? Again, we've already heard a lot of things around one location for information, clear expectations, clear access or easy access to forms, making sure that we know right up front what needs to happen so folks can just get it done, get it through the process, be registered. But I want to hear what else, because again, I've asked fairly specific questions up to this point, and I'm going to leave it open, see what folks have to say. Let me get that back on the screen. There we go. All right. So again, the question is, what do you think should be considered for an application process for provider registration? All right, and I see let's see Stephanie. I'm sorry, I'm started chuckling at it because I feel like I've lived through that before. Stephanie says, I think that having an application that is straightforward and not convoluted with 800 sections and 1,000 subsections. Yeah, I can understand that. Right, we have another comment saying, be sure applicants know what to expect throughout the whole process. For example, after your application is completed, X, Y, and Z will happen. This will take X amount of time. If you have questions, contact this person. All right, so that clear expectations, clear understanding or communication about the process. Consideration for process timeline, adequate staffing capacity for the area agencies on aging or AAAs. Will impact how quickly we can respond. All right, great point, Connie. Thanks for bringing that up. Nicole says design from user experience standpoint, align with best practices, clarity of roles at Washington State and area agency on aging level, adequate funding for staffing, ensure technology is simple, clear, and always works. Yes. What else? I think we have already some really great things. And this is why I wanted this open-ended question a bit more of what else, because there is so much that goes into a process that needs to be considered. And we have that consideration for the process timeline, that clear communication, clear expectations. We have the importance of technology, that if we use it, it needs to work. It needs to also be user-friendly. So when folks are trying to navigate the system, that they're not fighting the technology. I see I think a question here, is there a feedback mechanism whereby when licenses are canceled or non-renewed, DSHS or the appropriate agency would then cross-reference the list of WellCares providers in order to update and remove the registrant? I think I understand your question, Stephen, but if I am responding incorrectly, please correct me. We are going to have tracking systems, of course, for who is registered and who's not. And then we do intend to have a accessible system for beneficiaries to be able to see who's registered and who's not. So if you're a beneficiary looking for a provider, that you could go out into this space and find a provider that's already registered, because maybe you don't have a family caregiver, maybe you don't already have one lined up, but you need to know where to turn. So we will have a resource for that. We're still very much developing all of that, but we do know that that the idea is there, that we want some sort of central location. So with that, if registrations are terminated or non-renewed, that they would be removed from that space that shows registered Washington Cares Fund providers. So beneficiaries aren't thinking that they are a beneficiary available to use their WellCares benefit with. Not that they're, I think I said the wrong word in there, but that beneficiaries think that know that that they're not a provider for Washington Cares Fund, and don't think that they can use their benefit with them. So we're hoping to keep that up to date. If I misunderstood that question, Stephen, please feel free to put it back in. Okay, if someone loses their license, like their business license or license to provide the care that they are registered to provide, how would we find out? And we are still working through that as far as working with the entities out there that do license these types of providers, and we have a variety of providers, thinking through how will we navigate that. So I don't have necessarily an answer to that just yet, but we are certainly thinking about how do we make sure that these lines of communication remain open, or that we're doing frequent checks, or how do we make sure that that the registered provider still meets all of our minimum qualifications, and within that, one of them would be licensed to do business in the state of Washington. All right, and then I see, or if the agency had a Medicaid contract that got canceled or terminated and also was a registered Washington Cares Fund provider. And there is certainly a space where somebody could cancel a Medicaid contract but remain a Washington Cares Fund provider. for various reasons. Maybe they're no longer accepting Medicaid, or they've made a business decision not to do that, but they remain with Washington Cares Fund. But we are looking at figuring out how do we manage when somebody has had a contract terminated for cause, or due to performance concerns or safety concerns, things like that. How do we catch those to make sure that folks are still meeting our minimum requirements over on the Washington Cares Fund side? So a lot to figure out. There's still really, we'll say, we're still at the early stages of a lot of these discussions, but very interested to hear your thoughts if there's anything we should consider. And again, we're going to talk more about these things in upcoming rulemaking session, or in the upcoming sessions. We will get into provider registration, but also termination of registrations and those types of things. So more to come on that. Joan says, could there be image or flowchart diagrams and or videos explaining the application process and timeline? It's a great idea. So some sort of visual support, and maybe visual with audio explaining the application process and timeline could be helpful. All right. Well, again, if you're still typing, keep typing, but let's move on to the next prompt. Our next one is, what kind of questions may come up for a provider trying to complete the application process? So this is, really coming from a place of what else should we be thinking about, but also what kind of questions can we answer in rule? So again, we're here for rulemaking, we're here for talking about that, but what kind of questions can we anticipate answering in rule to make it easier for folks to navigate the system? So we've already talked a lot about various parts of the application process so far, but it sounds like we may have a number of folks here who are providers or work for providers or work with providers. So thinking about what kind of questions might come up. I think that will be really helpful for us to try and get ahead of that and clarifying it here in rule. All right, so Cole kicked us off on this one, saying what are the requirements and what requirements can be waived and by whom for what? All right, thank you. I think that will be a really important one, be kind of front and center in my mind of the rules, though there's really no front and center in a chapter, but certainly a really important question to be answered in rule. And what else? And then I see, will the COI need to have additional insured like AAA and DSHS contracts? And I know COI, but I don't know COI. So Heather, could you clarify? Okay, thank you, Amy. COI, certificate of insurance, need to have additional insured like AAA and DSHS contracts. I think we're still working through that, Heather, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. One way or another, if there's something there we should be considering. I don't have an answer for that one off the top of my head. Joan says, will the provider have to complete the application forms and upload documents in one sitting, or can they save and come back to later and complete? Okay, so that'd be a good question to answer. And I recognize too, Heather, that you asked the question answering, I think, the question I have on the screen, and I took it as a question. Either way here. So good question to have to prepare for to answer. Will the COI need to have additional insured like AAA and DSHS contracts? Another question from Joan, will the provider have to complete the application forms and upload documents in one sitting, or can they come back and save later to complete? So some questions that we will need to prepare for when it comes to how a provider completes the application process and what questions they may have for us. Wonderful. What else? So I see Amy said, not sure if this will be addressed in rule, but many providers considering an application wonder how many clients they will work with, referrals they will get, how clients will find out about them, etc. Okay. Yeah, I think that would be a really good thing for us to clarify, whether it's in rule or in some sort of supporting document. Certainly, I think that could be helpful for providers to understand what it means when they join the program, what to expect for that. Thank you. Heather said, only problem with additional insured on certificate of insurance is if the contract is not a single statewide contract, each contract manager requests something different, makes it confusing for insurance companies. If it's statewide, it wouldn't matter. Thank you. Thanks for putting that in there, Heather. All right. Well, all right. Cole said, what's the timeline for an ineligible contract reapplication? Medicaid open application, contract application is 6 months. All right. That would be a good one for us to clarify for folks, or prepare to clarify for folks here, either in rule or in some sort of supporting document. But I think this one certainly would be a good one to have in rule as far as timeline, what that looks like. So thank you. All right, I'm going to move us into our next question, but we don't have to be done with anything that we've talked about so far. You're welcome to bring up a question or answer to any of the things that we've put in so far. Our last prompt here, though, for us today are what provider rights should be considered for rulemaking. And Vicki gave us a brief overview of, generally what we're thinking so far, but I think we have a lot of great minds here in the room. I know we've already had a really great discussion, and I've certainly feel very excited about the information I'm learning today. But thinking about provider rights and what should be considered there. So I'll open that up, and again, this is a pretty broad one, but thinking about rulemaking, we'll be thinking about provider rights when it comes to rulemaking, what needs to be included in that, and curious what you all have to say about that. I see Whitney said a timeline on how long after denial a provider can appeal the decision, such as 30 days to appeal. Stephanie said if contracts are fee for service, the contractor shouldn't have so much control over how the provider runs the program. All right, wonderful. Thank you for kicking us off here to both of you. What else? All right. Connie said provider rights slide listed interpreter translations and application assistance. What exactly do each of those mean? Well, right now they're pretty broad, so I'm curious what you would want them to mean. Not to, in the sense that we haven't really necessarily written something out here for them, but thinking through that they would have the right to interpreter or, interpreter services or translation services to navigate the application process, and application assistance meaning our customer care center, being able to call in or email and ask questions about the application process. But I'm curious what you would want those to mean, just so we can take that into consideration when trying to explain these or define these as we move forward, or whether or not they feel like they are applicable rights. So I'm curious if you could share a bit more on that, Connie. So Stephen said, I'm remembering from an earlier forum, providers will be expected to enter a contract with WellCares to accept its rates as payment in full, correct? That wasn't decided, but seems to be 90% where the state has headed. I think we have not finished those discussions. I may be outdated, but I think that we are still working on that. So at this point, I don't have an update on that one. But more to come as we finish up discussions and start ironing things out as we move through rates and what those look like. So Colt said alignment with Medicaid contract where possible. Area Agency on Aging contract staff may also be Medicaid contract managers. A provider may have a WellCares and a Medicaid contract. Consistency of rule helps simplicity and consistency of process. Wonderful, thank you. And Stephen said, I only asked because that contract should be part of the online application process. Wonderful, thanks for clarifying that. And that is something good for us to keep in mind, that maybe connecting those pieces there, make sure that's clear. So thanks. I see Stephanie saying the interpreter translator aren't provided to us automatically. We're expected to find and pay for the service. They should be referred to us by the Area Agency on Aging and paid for on their end if we're to provide service to all. All right. And Stephanie, I'm not too sure could you clarify who us is in this context, just so I know kind of when interpreting this comment, who the us is. Oh, okay, thank you. So us is provider. So the interpreter translator aren't provided to providers automatically. They're expected to find and pay for the service. Wonderful. Okay, that's good for us to know and certainly consider. And I'm wondering too, is that with current Medicaid practice, like is that what your experiences have been with Medicaid? Because that'll be helpful for us to consider. And Heather said, agree completely with Stephanie. It's very difficult to get assistance with an interpreter. Wonderful, thank you. Right, and Connie said if AAAs or area agencies on aging are expected to pay for translation and interpreter service for a provider, the state should provide the funding for that. Okay, thanks for letting us know. And I see Stephanie agreeing wholeheartedly there. All right, that's good to know. And thank you for clarifying and bringing these up. When we were thinking about it, again, we hadn't necessarily gotten to this level yet. We're still very much in the early stages of just thinking like, what could be here. So thinking about that impact to providers and what's currently expected for providers, but also how that could impact the AAAs or again, area agencies on aging. I think that's really helpful to be hearing from you all today. So I see Cole saying interpreter or translation support for providers not a requirement for the area agencies on aging. There's impact for implementation to this if it is a requirement. Area agencies on aging should be engaged in this discussion. Wonderful. Thanks for bringing that up. And it's good to hear. Again, really good to hear kind of that this isn't the standard right now. It sounds like in the Medicaid world, but also that impact, what to consider there. So Whitney said, will there be a paper version of the application available for accessibility? If so, will there be translated versions of the application available for applicants? And that's something certainly we're considering, just as far as like what does that mean, and making sure that we are being accessible to applicants of all different kinds. We're serving all different populations in Washington State, recognizing that for some folks, English may not be their first language, but that shouldn't be the barrier for becoming a registered provider. So how can we support folks with that? And we're still, again, in the very early stages of figuring out what the application would be and what form it would come in, but recognizing that maybe a paper version may be an important piece for accessibility, especially around needing translations. So thank you for that. And Heather said, off topic from this, but maybe have the client application be equipped with a button for needing a translator, have a translator assigned to them for any contact with providers of any kind. Wonderful. All right. Yeah, we certainly want to make sure that for those who English is not their primary language, that we are not barring them from engaging in the both in the registration process, but also as a beneficiary and getting a provider. So thinking about how we make sure all providers have an opportunity here is important to us. And then said in consideration, interpreter translation support would not stop at application. Okay. All right. What other rights? I know we're talking a lot about interpreter and translation. I don't want to stop that, but thinking about what else is out there, and curious if other things come to mind as well. Again, keep talking about interpreter and translation if you'd like, but if anything else comes to mind, I'd like to hear that. So Beth says we should also include those with diminished hearing or sight, not just English as a second language. All right. So what else? What other rights should be considered? All right. Well, I'm not seeing anything yet, but if you're typing, again, keep typing, it's okay. But I am going to share some resources with the group here. I'm going to drop these in the chat. We have our DSHS website. I shared this earlier on in the presentation today. It's walkcaresfund.wa.gov/rulemaking. This is where you're going to be able to register for upcoming rulemaking sessions. Again, we're going to get into more detail around the registration process for providers on June 12th at 2 o'clock. You can also register for the other ones coming up as well, but also you can see ones that we've already done. So if you are just joining us or you've missed a few, these are recorded, they're available on that website, as well as the slide deck. So maybe you've sat through it, you've listened to it, but you want to go back and kind of jog your memory on something we've talked about so far. That's all available there at that DSHS website. We also have the Employment Security Department website there on the screen. It's also in the chat. They are also doing rulemaking for Washington Cares Fund right now, and they are focusing on other parts, not what we're focusing on here in DSHS, but it is super valuable, and certainly your voice is important on that site as well. So you can find more information about what they're doing, any sort of listening sessions they're doing, or input opportunities on their website. The Healthcare Authority also has a website for rulemaking. They do not expect to be doing rulemaking until 2025, but I always want to make sure you have this link to make sure that when the time comes that they're doing rulemaking, you know where to turn. But also, if you're interested in other rulemaking activity that HCA is doing, you have information about where to find that. You can send questions regarding the Washington Cares Fund program or WaCares Fund or WaCares program to walkcares@dshs.wa.gov. Our wonderful customer care team is working diligently at answering questions, helping make sure folks have the information they need about our program. So if you have a question, send it over to them. They are a wonderful group of folks who can help us out. With that, as always, I appreciate y'all being here. If you have questions about rulemaking, the rulemaking process, or you have something that you just didn't get a chance to say today or in past sessions, shoot me an email. I'm happy to receive that information at any time, even if it's the first or second meeting that we did and you're rewatching it, you can still email me about it and provide your input. With that, We'll see you all again on June 12th at 2 o'clock. We'll be discussing provider registration requirements in more detail. Thank you all for being here and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.